1986 was not a great year for the Soviet Union in all honesty. Not great, not terrible at least. There was the whole exploding nuclear reactor thing going on at Chernobyl, but not to worry, it was only spewing out a bit of burnt concrete and 3.6 Rotkin, although somehow it was making everyone that went near it turn into goo. But not to worry, the state said it will be fixed and there is nothing to worry about, and they would never lie to the people that they represent.
Внимание! 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 Внимание!
Well, it can't get any worse, can it? It's not like food is getting harder to get and afford, and nobody wants to work anymore, and everyone just wants to sit and watch their TVs. Just forget about it, and take a cruise on the half-century-old captured Weimar-era passenger liner, the SS Nakhimov. Absolutely nothing could go wrong. Nothing bad ever happens in the Great People's Union, and hey, it's not like the ship could sink for a third time. The SS Nakhimov actually has quite the interesting origin story. As with quite a few large ships of the post-war USSR and onwards, she was not actually built in the Soviet Union, but was actually built in Germany. See, after the First World War, the Germans found themselves quite literally up shit creek when it came to the nautical department. Before the war, the German steamers were world-renowned. What you might not know is that barely a few weeks after the Titanic sailed and, plopped itself on the bottom of the ocean, the Germans actually won up to the British steamers by making an even bigger ship, the SS Imperator. Granted, it wasn't the most stable, and it was called the Limperator by the crew and the passengers because it, rolled around like a big cylinder, but they still did it. The Germans also built two other major ships of the kind and other force-funneled superliners such as Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse. The great race for ocean liner dominance was really, at the time, between Britain and Germany, with the United States lagging very far behind and France kind of not even bothering and just sort of building luxurious ships. But, of course, in 1914 the whole war thing kind of got in the way. It wasn't exactly cognizant to good health to go gallivanting across the Atlantic in an ocean liner, as the RMS Lusitania shortly found out. It was even worse if you were in a German liner, because just to get out of the North Sea you had to run the gauntlet of the world's largest navy. So, the three big German ships, the Imperator, Vaterland and Bismarck, all built in Hamburg, sort of just bobbed about and didn't do too much during the war. After the defeat of the German army, and yes, it was defeated, the three big ships were spread amongst the victors, with the Imperator being given to the Cunard Line to replace RMS Lusitania as RMS Berengaria, the Vaterland went to the United States and became the SS Leviathan, and the last ship, being completed as the RMS Majestic, given to the White Star Line to replace the sister ship of the Titanic, the HMHS Britannic, that went down during the war. That was the case across the entire German merchant fleet, to be honest, in particular the ocean liners. The number of major ships sunk by the U-boats along with the scuttling of German warships made the Allies genuinely quite vengeful. They quickly seized as many ships as possible and forbid, according to the Treaty of Versailles, the construction of new major warships. Even the Emden, the first cruiser built after the war, was so woefully outdated it's not even funny. It did look nice though. The civilian shipyards though did have a bit of an opportunity here, and they sought out contracts to make ships desperately to get the economy working during the Weimar years. One of those was the shipyard of Bremer Vulkan, who received in the early 1920s the contract to build a new German liner from Norddeutsche Lloyd, or North German Lloyd. The new ship wasn't going to be the biggest, it wasn't going to be the fastest or the most magnificent, but she would be rather impressive all the same. Measuring up to 174 metres long, 21 metres at the beam and travelling along at an economical 16 knots, the SS Berlin was launched on the 25th of March 1925 from Yard 614, and it was commissioned that September. The SS Berlin would be assigned to the Bremen, Southampton, Cherbourg, New York City route, kind of like the Titanic route with an extra stop, and would serve this route quite successfully from 1925 to 1939, and it was a relatively uneventful career, with one notable exception. In 1928, the Berlin came to the rescue of the passengers of the Vestris, a steamer that had gone down off the coast of Virginia en route from Barbados. 113 would die in the sinking, but 60 passengers and 155 crew would survive with the help of the Berlin. In 1939, the Berlin was chartered by the Nazis for one of those very fake Strength Through Joy vacation cruises as a reward for hard workers. This was nominally part of the whole Volksgemeinschaft thing, and it was pure propaganda, to show off that if you worked hard and became a good little Nazi, you would get rewarded. In reality, these kind of cruises didn't happen very often, and when they did, they were highly choreographed, as everything was within the Nazi state. After the war started, the Berlin was requisitioned by the Nazi government as a hospital ship, in German a Lazarettschiff. The ship would mostly be used for accommodation and transport for military personnel through the war though. Given that the war was not exactly nautically successful for the Germans after 1941 outside of submarines, that meant that the ship pretty much had an uneventful war, right up until 1945 when the Red Army started tearing its way through East Prussia. The ship would then be assigned to Operation Hannibal, which was the mass transport of civilians and soldiers from the eastern Baltic to the west, but while forming up in a convoy on the 31st of January, the ship hit a mine near Swinemünde and was put under tow, and then it hit another mine. The ship would then be beached and all of its equipment would be stripped off just before midnight in shallow waters with only one fatality and abandoned, where the Soviets would find her sometime later. In a funny twist of fate, the Berlin, yes, the ship that was sitting in shallow water rusting, was awarded to the Soviet Union as a war reparation, and the industrious little Baltic fleet got to work in 1946 sealing up the ship. In 1947, the ship was raised and then promptly exploded again, for reasons, sinking for a second time. This trapped a diver underneath the ship, but interestingly, the massively chunky copper helmet the Soviet was wearing kind of saved his life because it sort of got pinned and he couldn't really move, but it held him in place and his comrades were able to dive down and dig a big hole under the ship to get him out. On the second attempt, the raising of the Berlin was successful and she was sent for repairs. The Soviets decided to rename their new toy, albeit with some plugged holes, the Admiral Nakhimov, after an old 19th century Russian naval commander who played a role in the Russian Navy getting absolutely slapped around during the Crimean War. She entered service in 1957, and in 1962 she was used to transport soldiers to Cuba during the missile crisis. I just want to say that voyage would have been horrible, because the ship was built to the North Sea and they sent it to the tropics. The ship would then become very famous as a Soviet passenger ship for several years, particularly in the Black Sea, travelling from Odessa to Batumi and back on 6-day round cruises, taking advantage of the cruising season for the well-off but totally equal to the rural farmers, city-living Soviet citizens. And so, this is where we find ourselves on the evening of the 31st of April 1986, when the now 60-plus-year-old Admiral Nakhimov with her 888 passengers and 346 crew set off from Novorossiysk, most of the passengers on board being Ukrainians, Moldovans and Russians. The captain of the ship was Vadim Markov, and the first mate was Alexander Chudnovsky. Yes, his name was Chud. A few minutes after clearing the docks and with a pilot at the helm of the ship, it came into contact with the 18,000-ton Japanese-built but Russian-bought bulk-carrying cargo ship, the Pyotr Vasev, and somebody on the bridge noticed that they were on a bit of a collision course. So having a slight concern that his ship may not survive a fourth giant hole in it, the captain radioed off to the Vasev and said, "Hey, can we not smack into each other?" The Vasev was pretty amenable to not role-playing a battering ram, and it responded back with, "Don't worry, we will pass clear of each other, and we will take care of everything." Now for those who are nautically inclined, I know you just cringed because the rules of the ocean exist for a reason, and the very sorry, "Don't worry about it, it'll be fine," wasn't entirely the best thing to hear over the radio. But satisfied everything was going to be fine, Captain Vadim Markov retired to his cabin and left Officer Chud in command, who continued to potter along. Meanwhile, the Vasev just didn't bother changing course, because its captain quite literally went, "Meh, we won't hit it." Officer Chud radioed a few times asking where they were, and if they could move, but would decide to just change his course, and according to a couple of sources, didn't bother telling the Vasev he did it. But don't worry, because apparently the Vasev just ignored the Nakhimov anyway during the radio contact, so if they'd have listened, who knows? At 11:10 PM, Chudnovsky screamed across the radio to the Vasev to go full astern her engines, and the Nakhimov turned to port after they spotted each other, but it was completely useless at this point. 2 minutes later, the Vasev hit the Nakhimov barely 8 nautical miles from Novorossiysk, and absolute horror ensued. Now the passengers were mostly in bed, but those on deck could do nothing but watch the immense freighter tear right into the side of the ship and leave an 84-metre square hole in the side between the engines and the boilers. Immediately the Nakhimov's lights went out, leaving hundreds trapped below, in a maze of corridors as the ship rolled over. The lack of power meant that the watertight doors didn't actually close. Not that it would have necessarily saved the ship, but it could have bought them time. There was absolutely no time to launch the lifeboats, but even then it would have been impossible, as in true Soviet fashion, the lifeboat davits didn't work because they were so rusted, and being given the landlord special of being painted over non-stop so they looked good, but were so clogged that they were stuck in place. Rafts were thrown overboard, and people dived into the water, holding onto whatever they could, but the ship would sink in only 7 minutes, with rescue teams arriving in just 10 minutes as the ship was, well, next to the harbour. The Vasev was mostly undamaged and did actually stop to render some assistance. The passengers and the crew had little time to escape. Of the 1,234 aboard, 423 drowned. The Black Sea Shipping Company sent out their rescue ship, the SS-21, and it arrived 10 hours later. The divers of the Black Sea Fleet also got involved in the rescue attempt. The old ship upturned and a maze of corridors, as I said, was a nightmare for the divers, as well as the passengers, and 2 of the rescues were actually killed trying to navigate the ship, where they thought people were still trapped alive in air pockets. In all, this disaster was absolutely horrific, but it begs the question, how did the ship sink this fast? Well, the answer was it was the Soviet Union. So how did this large ship get sunk? It's a serious question that I'm posing. I mean, it likely had something to do with the giant bloody hole caused by the giant freighter smacking into it, but there's a bit more to it. The Nakhimov was built to an extremely high standard by the Germans in 1925, half a century earlier, but there were some changes made that caused a few complications to the ship's ability to keep the wet stuff out. First things first, the ventilation was absolutely god-awful, as I mentioned briefly when I went to Cuba. I mean, shockingly, it was god-awful. It was built for the North Atlantic, and the Soviets were trying to use it as a cruise ship near the Black Sea, so, it got a bit hot. The lack of ventilation, which nobody tried to fix over the 40 or so years, led the Soviets to do one thing. Well, it led to them to have everybody make the decision to leave their portholes open. Pretty much every single porthole on the entire ship. That alone may not seem too dangerous, but don't worry, it'll get a lot worse. See, to make better use of the ship, the Soviets decided in the biggest of brain moments just to remove some of the bulkheads. Things that, had they been there, would have stopped the sinking or at least slowed it to a point to allow the launching of lifeboats. Well, that's if the bloody things were ever maintained, and they could be launched in the first place, but, whatever. But the funniest part of all of this, in terms of just Soviet incompetence, is that even if the bulkheads were there, and the lifeboats had time to be launched, they couldn't actually be launched, not because of the clogging, but because they could only be launched with electric winches, which didn't work when the engines were turned off. Look, I'm not going to say it's the worst kind of nautical disaster through incompetence. I mean, there's that one Greek line from the 60s that was pretty horrific. But for the love of God, don't go on Aeroflot and don't get on a Russian-maintained ocean liner from half a century ago and expect the safety features to work. If the murder of the safety features were not enough to aggravate you, it's about to get worse, because what came after was violently Soviet. First things first, we need to understand the context of exactly when this happened. I alluded to it at the start, but this was just a few months after the Chernobyl nuclear reactor number 4 detonated, and the Soviet government was not exactly pleased with another embarrassment. So they didn't even allow reporting that the ship had sunk for 48 hours, and even then, the people who survived were only permitted to send a simple signal that they were in fact alive and safe. And that was it. In terms of foreign and domestic news, nobody really paid attention to what had occurred because, let's be honest, Chernobyl was a bit bigger of an issue, and the Soviet government was happy to rely on the news media being unable or unwilling to report on more than one bad thing at a time. The Soviet government formed a commission of inquiry to investigate what had actually happened, and as an upside to the situation, they didn't need to actually find a scapegoat, as there were a couple already neatly there. Both the captain of the Nakhimov and the Vasev were deemed to have violated international safety rules. Despite multiple orders to let the Nakhimov pass, the captain of the Vasev, Tchenko, refused to slow his ship down, and only actually reported the incident 40 minutes after it happened. Now remember, the ship sank in 7 minutes. Captain Markov was in trouble, because he was not on the bridge, which he should have been because his ship was going out of port. And, it was the whole, yeah, it'll be fine, it's a ship coming towards us, it'll be fine, let them deal with it. The inquiry into the sinking took place in Odessa during March 1987, and both of the captains were sent to prison for 15 years each, but released in early autumn, which is fall for the Yanks, because, leaf fall down, in 1992. The wildest part of the story so far, in my opinion, is that after his minimum prison sentence, Markov, the captain of the ocean liner who went, meh, it'll be fine, and then went to bed, became a mentor for captains in the Black Sea Shipping Company. It died in Odessa in 2007. Meanwhile, the captain of the Vasev, Tchenko, went abroad, and somehow died in a yacht crash near Canada. Nobody really knows what happened, but I mean, it might have been a similar cause of death to certain members of the Russian government, or he could have just not paid attention and crashed into something. There was a precedent there, so who knows. The Nakhimov, meanwhile, lies on the bottom, not too far from Novorossiysk, and now on the bottom of the Black Sea, it is joined by, well, a significant portion of the Russian Black Sea fleet. It's not lonely anymore. Now, I'm actually somewhat running out of ideas. Call it a brain fade for the meantime, and not the fact that I accidentally deleted my list of videos to make when I changed PCs. Please don't look into that, I definitely didn't do that. So comment below your ideas for videos, and I'll take some on board. I'm considering the aircraft hijacking and attempt to fly to Finland from some Siberian farmer's saga, but let me know what you think. Any parts of history, be it ancient Egypt, Rome, Greece, all the way through to the medieval and modern period. Give me your ideas below. Thank you all for watching, like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll catch you next time.